Mary Waters grew up in Brooklyn and completed an undergraduate degree in philosophy at Johns Hopkins. She went on to earn an MA in 1983 and a PhD in 1986 in demography at Berkeley, and immediately moved back to the East Coast to join the sociology department at Harvard, where she has been ever since. She was chair of the department from 2001 to 2005. Waters has made herself one of the leading experts on the adaptation process of immigrants and their descendants. Tomás Jiménez started out on the West Coast, earning a 1998 bachelor's degree at the University of Santa Clara before traveling east to earn a 2001 MA and a 2005 PhD from Harvard, where Mary Waters chaired his dissertation committee. He then went back to California and joined the faculty at Stanford, where he is now the Director of Graduate Studies in Sociology and Director of the undergraduate program in Comparative Studies in Race and Ethnicity. His research has centered on the idea of replenishment of migrant streams, or the lack of it, and how this affects the assimilation process for immigrant populations. This article, like other articles that appear in each year's issue of the Annual Review of Sociology, was invited by the editors. They seek out leading authorities around the country on specific topics and invite them to write review articles about the major issues of the day. These articles are supposed to review the state of our knowledge about such an issue, not just report the results of one small slice of that research. From Waters and Jiménez, we can get an overview of the whole topic of immigrant assimilation, at least until a few years from now when the editors invite somebody else to write the next version. By that time, maybe that somebody else will be you. Make the life-changing decision to pack up their entire lives and move from one country to another, becoming immigrants in a new land, they often become what Robert Park in 1928 called marginal men. They stand with one foot in their cultures of origin and the other in the new culture that has become their destination. In fact, Park suggested that these people who can see two different ways of life, and therefore can't take either one of them for granted as natural or better, are the ultimate source of innovation and social change. But the perspective on immigrants that dominated a lot of the discussion in the 20th century was looking at them not from their own point of view as migrants, but from the point of view of the society that had taken them in as new members. Milton Gordon's 1964 book, Assimilation in American Life, summed up this vantage point, describing immigrants as a social problem and asking how best to resolve that problem. This idea from a generation or two earlier that immigrants might represent a valuable stimulus for renewal and growth in society had been put on the shelf in favor of the concept of assimilation instead. So first of all, we need to clarify some vocabulary words about what happens to such immigrants. The word assimilation requires our attention before anything else. This word gets misused a lot. Many people, including some who should know better, often use it to describe what immigrants do to adapt themselves consciously to their new social environment. But this is not what it means at all. The term was borrowed directly by Milton Gordon and others from the field of biology, specifically from the study of how living things sustain themselves by consuming food. If you had breakfast this morning, you are assimilating your breakfast right now as you view this lecture. To assimilate something means to take it into yourself and then to absorb and transform it so that its original constituents, like vitamins and minerals and proteins and carbohydrates, become part of your own organism. So just as you assimilate your breakfast, Gordon and other scholars of immigration thought that the host society had to assimilate immigrants and transform them into parts of itself. Assimilation is something done by the host society, not by the immigrants. The host society assimilates immigrants. The immigrants are assimilated by the host society. They are the direct object, not the subject, when you use the word assimilate in a sentence. Naturally, if these scholars decided to look at the relation between immigrants and a host society in this way, the outcome that they expected to see, and that they defined as successful assimilation, would involve absorbing and transforming the immigrants and making them into a new version of themselves, stripping away any old languages and other details of their former lives that might be inconsistent with the rules of the game in the host society, turning them into Americans. Over the last half-century or so, this one-dimensional assimilationist perspective has been revised due to research showing that migrants apparently can sustain strong ties to their original cultural backgrounds and yet manage to become comfortable and productive in a new host society, at least in some host societies that will tolerate such diversity in the population. At the same time, other migrants may lose touch with their original cultural heritage, but fail to find a way to fit into the new host society either. So we've changed a little how we think about what goes on in a society like the United States as it assimilates new immigrants. Still, though, this assimilation is something that the host society does to immigrants. It is not something that immigrants do themselves. So what kind of word can we use to describe what the immigrants themselves are actually doing all this time, while a host society may or may not be trying to assimilate them? The word we want in this case to describe the efforts of immigrants to find their way in a new land is acculturation. If you move to a new country with a new language and lots of other new laws, customs, and details of everyday life, you can attempt to acculturate at many different levels. At the most personal, private level, your own attitudes may change. You may start trying to think of yourself as an American, or a Frenchman, or a member of whatever society in which you've landed. You may decide that your new favorite food is something you found locally. This is what happened to me when I moved to the South within the United States and discovered hush puppies and grits and collard greens and, above all, real biscuits, after which I could never eat an English muffin again. These changes in private attitudes may go along with changes in behavior. I know that I speak more slowly now than I did before I moved to the South, and I say hey to people now instead of hi. And my younger daughter even learned to say sir and ma'am to grown-ups, though it was too late for my older daughter on that score. There are lots of really fascinating examples of immigrants adapting unusual versions of the culture of their new host society in order to prove that they really are a part of that society. We might think of Japanese immigrants in the United States, some of whom have actually formed their own motorcycle gangs. What could be more American than a motorcycle gang? Immigrant parents from many countries have been heard telling their children to speak English like a real American. Of course, there may be discrepancies between such attitudes and actions. People may mimic host cultural behavior on the outside, but still feel like the old country on the inside. Or other migrants may become enthusiasts about everything in their new home, from sports to food to clothing or even politics, but still feel locked out of the day-to-day practical life of the society due to rejections they experience from the native-born population. We human beings tend to be full of contradictions anyway, and this adaptation process is no exception. But when can we tell that these efforts by migrants to acculturate are paying off and that they're becoming assimilated into the host society? One surefire way to measure this looks not just at the isolated thoughts and actions of an individual migrant, but at the patterns of social relationships that are formed between migrants and members of the host society. One such relationship might be that of employer and employee, so that natives and migrants find themselves working together in some enterprise. An even more telling relationship, though, appears in the form of intimate unions between migrants and natives. When they start marrying each other, we know that we are seeing some assimilation going on. So the key to studying acculturation and any resulting assimilation that takes place for immigrants always must explicitly put them into a larger social context and see them in their connections of one kind or another with the rest of the host society around them. Recognizing this need to view immigrants in the larger context of the host society, rather than just asking them questions only about themselves, the next question we must address concerns how to select the appropriate comparison group. At the most basic level, we might just compare the attitudes or actions or relationships of a group of immigrants to the whole undifferentiated native-born population. But if we recognize that in a nation of immigrants like the United States, in some ways the so-called melting pot of different origins never really melted, and that there are a lot of diverse subcultures going on even among the native-born population living here for generations or centuries, maybe it doesn't entirely make sense to compare immigrant Vietnamese people in California to people in Vermont who've been living there for over 200 years and many generations. So another alternative that Waters and Jiménez suggest is that we might compare a group of recent immigrants to people already in the country, perhaps a generation or two now, who are American citizens that never lived anywhere else, but who can trace back an ethnic identity to some point in the past that is shared with the immigrants. This only works, of course, if the immigrants are not the very first representatives of their culture ever to show up in the new host society. Assuming that we can make such comparisons, we turn next to the features of social life that Waters and Jiménez choose as the best indicators of whether immigrants are being assimilated successfully into the social body of American society. Earlier, one good way to judge whether immigrants are being assimilated into a host society goes straight to what is for many people the most important question. How much money are you making? One good sign of assimilation of immigrants would be to discover that they have found jobs and are making as much money as the native-born population. Various ethnic groups may be quite different in some ways, but their money is all the same color if you are operating a store or other business. If we gather income figures and look at them over the last half of the 20th century, after the new wave of migrants had restarted and millions of people were once again entering American society countries, we see a rather disappointing picture. Waters and Jiménez review these well-known, even famous research results for us. If you consider the wages earned by the first immigrants who began coming into the United States in the 1960s, nobody would be too surprised by learning that when they first arrived, their wages were well below those of native-born workers. Let us take this starting wage earned by immigrants when they first arrive as a standard, though, and see how things develop after they have been here a while. If we set that starting wage equal to a reference point of 1.0, then the log of that reference value of 1 will be 0. If people earn higher and higher wages over time, the log of such higher wages will be positive, greater than 0. But if their wages deteriorate for some reason, the log of those lower wages will be negative, less than 0. It turns out that the immigrants who arrived in the 1960s did very well. After they had been here for 10 years, their wages were typically about 10 to 15% higher than when they first arrived. After 20 years in the country, their wages averaged more than 20% higher than at the starting point. In fact, they almost caught up with native-born workers, indicating that they were being assimilated quite successfully, at least in this economic sense. Immigrants who arrived a decade later in the 1970s at first repeated the experience of the 1960s immigrants, gaining about a 13% increase in wages over their first decade in America. However, at that point, their wage gains flattened out and did not increase as fast as for the earlier group, so that they lagged behind that earlier group later in their new lives in the new country. The immigrants arriving in the 1980s saw only about half the wage gains experienced by previous groups of immigrants in their first decade in the country, and then also experienced wage stagnation for the next couple of decades. This group of immigrants never came close to catching up to native-born workers in terms of wages. And finally, immigrants arriving in the closing years of the century in the late 1990s experienced no improvements in their wages at all. Even during the first decade of their American experience, they actually tended to lose ground in wage levels. These 4 generations of immigrants show us a gradual deterioration of economic assimilation. The earliest immigrants did the best, and the most recent immigrants did the worst in establishing themselves in jobs that paid good wages. And this picture does not even include consideration of immigrants who could not find jobs at all, and so were not included in calculations of average wages. What are we to make of this deterioration? Not all immigrants are identical, interchangeable candidates for jobs and wages. If we look at the characteristics of immigrants who arrived in the 1960s, compared to those who arrived in the 1990s, we find that the earlier immigrants had higher levels of education, while the most recent immigrants are more likely to come from impoverished rural backgrounds and to have little or no formal schooling. This means that they lack some of the basic skills and credentials needed to move ahead in the American labor market. So perhaps the trend observed in wages is not so much about changes in the assimilation process, but rather about changes in the composition of the immigrant stream to be assimilated. We see this again if we look at the occupations taken up by immigrants into the United States. In the 1880s, during the era of so-called free migration, when there were few legal restrictions on who could enter the United States and no numerical limits on such population movements, people from all walks of life poured into the country. When we reopened the immigration process in the 1960s, however, we did so with some very different new rules. The previous broad current of immigrants coming into the country had been reduced to two much more specific streams. On the one hand, we continue to welcome doctors and scientists and engineers and other highly educated, highly skilled people, and of course anyone who wants to bring large amounts of cash into the country. But this brain drain of skilled talent that we siphon off from other countries around the world does not account for a very large population movement in demographic terms, even though half of the practicing GPs in the United States have foreign medical degrees today. Another stream of immigrants is coming in under the door rather than over the door, as in the case of the professional occupations. Who changes the beds in your hotel room? Who works in the meatpacking plants that turn cows, pigs, chickens, and other animals into the raw material for your dinner? Who picks the vegetables that come with your steak or fried chicken? Who looks after your elderly grandmother in her assisted living facility? There are a lot of jobs in the American economy that offer only low pay, low status, and difficult working conditions. And a lot of these jobs are done today by the other stream of immigrants, the people who are not seeing their wages rise after 10 years in the country. These two very different and opposite ends of the occupational spectrum are where we now find the highest proportions of foreign-born workers in the United States. This allows proponents of immigration to focus on the doctors and engineers and to argue that we couldn't survive without them. But this split personality of the immigrant population also allows the opponents of immigration to point to the poorly educated, poorly paid, seasonally employed, low-skilled immigrant workers and to paint them as dangerous and a drag on the economy. But after all, jobs and income for most people are just a means to an end. And that end is often a home and a life as a family in a safe and healthy community. So Waters and Jiménez also consider the plain fact of where people are living as a second approach to measuring immigrant assimilation. Are the immigrants mixing in with native-born populations residentially? The authors make the case that deliberate efforts by the federal government to settle Vietnamese immigrants, for example, all over the country, in places not used to a lot of immigrants in the past, has paid dividends as a policy. These immigrants settled in non-traditional settings, what Waters and Jiménez call new gateway destinations, and they appear to be enjoying more complete assimilation and less segregation. A third dimension of assimilation with a long history of research looks at the languages that people speak. Waters and Jiménez estimate that nearly 50 million people in the United States spoke another language besides English at the turn of the century in 2000. As documented from census questions asking about such language use in the home. This concern with languages dates far back across the decades of social research, particularly in the United States, where layer after layer of new immigrants from one sending country after another have created the contemporary decoupage appearance of American society today. In the American context, it is actually nothing new to have millions of newcomers speaking in foreign tongues. What is important from the perspective of assimilation is the extent to which they also overlay their original language with a new ability to communicate in English. This was never the strong suit of the first generation of immigrants, who often spoke German or Norwegian or Japanese or Italian or Polish in their homes and perhaps managed to learn enough heavily accented English to get by with shopping and other public tasks. It is the children who grow up with English all around them, and Waters and Jiménez, who both have studied this extensively in their personal research work, give us an optimistic assessment showing that contemporary immigrants and their descendants appear to be acquiring English language skills at least as fast as was true for previous generations of immigrants earlier in the century. Most first-generation native-born children of immigrants, no matter where they came from, already are proficient in English, even if they continue to enjoy the advantage of knowing a second language learned from their families. But the fourth and final dimension of assimilation reviewed by Waters and Jiménez always has been the clincher so far as immigration scholars have been concerned. We can compare immigrants to native-born people with respect to jobs and income, formal schooling, and language use, but all these measures just look at the immigrants in isolation as individuals. What really counts for social scientists is a network of salient interactions between people, specifically between immigrants and native-born people. Residential segregation measures get at this interaction question, at least indirectly, implying that people in segregated neighborhoods are less likely to interact with people from beyond those neighborhoods. But the ultimate form of social interaction in this respect has got to be intermarriage, intimate unions formed between immigrants and native-born people. Here, drawing on their own personal research experience, Waters and Jiménez are very clear about the results. The year before this article was published, Perlman and Waters had just published another article showing that Mexican immigrant women today are actually more likely to marry native-born husbands than was true nearly 100 years ago for Italian immigrant women who were coming into the country in great numbers then. This tendency to marry out into the native population is higher today for immigrant Mexican women, even though there are more immigrant Mexican men available that they might have married. So once again, Waters and Jiménez conclude that the great American assimilation machine is grinding along at least at the rate that it always seems to have done, gradually absorbing the new waves of immigrants from new places of origin and turning them into part of the ever-changing mosaic of American life. Recent trends in immigration into the United States, in order to illustrate some of their earlier conclusions about the assimilation process, Waters and Jiménez deal with two main issues, one dealing with immigrants across geographic space, and the other dealing with immigrants through time. On the first of these points, the question of where immigrants are settling in American society, they make a distinction between what they call the old and the new gateways for immigration. We are familiar with the old gateways already. These are the places that have been showing up in census data and in research studies as the centers of immigrant culture, political influence, and thus also assimilation at whatever rate it might be happening. The old traditional gateways include New York City, Miami, Chicago, Houston, Los Angeles, and other major metropolitan areas that have served as the first points of entry into the United States for more than a century, or even two. In these areas, as Waters and Jiménez make clear, a wide range of organizations have formed and matured to cater to the needs and interests of immigrants. Many of them have been able to shift their focus over the decades from one original ethnic immigrant population to other new groups as they begin to appear on the scene. These range from services related to employment, housing, or healthcare, to religious groups with special ethnic orientations, from culture-based special schools to political organizations highly attuned to the perspectives of immigrants. Newly arrived immigrants in such old gateways can expect to find many existing sources of support and ethnically based social networks that can assist them with career aspirations. The Cuban community in Miami and the population of Chinatown in San Francisco are classic examples, as were the Irish in Boston and the Polish population of Chicago in their own immigration eras. At one point, there were more Polish people in Chicago than in Warsaw. But the old established gateway cities and states also have another kind of established social reality. Generations of coexistence of different ethnic groups in a city like Boston or New York or Chicago can give rise to entrenched boundaries and barriers between groups, to deeply ingrained stereotypes and prejudices about people different from us on the part of both an ethnic population and the surrounding community, which often includes diverse other ethnic populations. So the old traditional gateways are a distinctly mixed bag, with some institutionalized advantages for immigrants on the one hand, but also perhaps some institutionalized barriers and discrimination on the other. Sometimes one side of this coin minted in the old traditional gateway cities and states is more visible, and sometimes the obverse comes up instead. So long as the advantages are most visible, these places will continue to attract new immigrants. But as Waters and Jiménez point out, in the late 20th century, the other side of the coin began to turn up more and more often, particularly in California, where public sentiment against immigrants grew more and more virulently hostile over time. As the disadvantages of being an immigrant multiplied and the benefits of the local community began to evaporate, the existing immigrant populations in these established areas began to launch some of their more adventurous and entrepreneurial pioneers out towards new destinations in other parts of the United States. Waters and Jiménez make clear that the origins of these new gateway destinations can be traced back to such pioneers from the existing immigrant population already in the old traditional gateway destinations inside the United States. Once these pioneers found fertile new ground in which to try their luck at reaching for the American dream, word got back not only to the old traditional gateway communities, but all the way back to the countries of origin from which the immigrants originated. This is why the largest and fastest growing foreign-born populations can be found in states bordering California, like Oregon, Nevada, and Arizona, as well as in Georgia, because it is just north of Florida. Only North Carolina, by virtue of its massive agricultural economy and demand for labor, is an exception to this rule of being a neighbor of an old traditional gateway state, among the top 5 new gateway states in Table 1 of the reading. Thus, once new immigrant communities put down their first tentative roots in places like Atlanta, Phoenix, Las Vegas, Portland, or other new gateway destinations, eventually the next wave of immigrants could come directly there when they first arrived in the United States. This entire proliferation process looks very much the same as it did for Germans when they first spread out from their points of entry in Chicago and New York, ending up in Missouri, Indiana, and as far away as West Texas and the Midlands of the Carolinas. But that was more than 100 years ago, and most people don't remember today that history is just repeating itself. Waters and Jiménez present a hopeful picture of these new gateway communities for immigrants, noting that because the destination communities are often smaller and have less experience with foreign-born populations, the generations of such direct experience that gave rise to deeply ingrained prejudices and stereotypes are missing, and this perhaps may give immigrants a chance to prove themselves on their own merits. These communities may learn to avoid the immigrant stereotype trap. This shift to the new gateways has not been going on very long yet, though, so their optimism may be premature. After all, a big part of the reason that the pioneer immigrants left the established old gateway communities and struck off into the heartland as they have done was because there were jobs for them in these new places. And those jobs have tended to be down towards the bottom of the economic totem pole in American life, working in unpleasant or even dangerous jobs for low pay and low social status. It doesn't take long for this kind of occupational concentration to be translated at the local level into vicious stereotypes, which will then quickly take on a life of their own in reinforcing social and economic hierarchies. So for my money, the jury definitely is still out on these new gateway communities, however optimistic the authors sound in this article. The second point that Waters and Jiménez make about the contemporary immigration picture is that it shows no signs of letting up so far. Of course, it can be misleading to look at absolute numbers of immigrants in a historical context. For example, the number of immigrants coming to the United States in the first decade of the 21st century is much larger than the number arriving back in the first decade of the 20th century. But the entire United States only had a little over 100 million inhabitants back then, too. And today that's over 300 million. So it takes a lot more immigrants to make the same sort of splash in this much larger pool today. Still, the percentage of foreign-born people in the country is rising rapidly towards levels not seen since about 100 years ago, and this is bound to have a lot of social consequences in our immediate future. In assessing what these consequences might be, including consequences for the process of assimilation above all, the authors point out that when the last wave of immigrants peaked around 1910, severe political and social reactions set in across the country, and for the next half century or so, the United States basically slammed the door on further immigration. This cut off what the authors call replenishment, that is, a continuing stream of new arrivals year after year coming in from the old country and reminding everybody, immigrants and native-born alike, of the cultural distinctiveness of the new arrivals. This whole field of research into immigrant assimilation did not even get started until after this replenishment, this continuing flow, had been cut off. Waters and Jiménez are convinced that a lot of the assimilation results that were observed in the middle of the 20th century happened in part because the immigrants themselves lost touch with their own origins, since nobody knew was coming over any longer. In that context, they may have been more receptive to being assimilated, and it may have been easier to assimilate them when the rest of the country knew that they would not be facing an indefinite project with ever new generations of arrivals. How does this translate into the present? Waters and Jiménez seem to assume that unlike the early 20th century, there will be no cutoff of this replenishment process now in the 21st century. And the immigrant wave will continue to build and sustain itself for many years to come. In that context, they suggest, the ongoing renewal of ties to the old country or countries may make it harder for immigrants to let go and to be assimilated into the American mainstream. And it may also make that American mainstream more hesitant about even wanting this continuing flow of people to join them in the first place. Only time will tell whether this expectation of the authors is right or not. But we also might want to think about the last round of elections in a different light. Is American society reacting now to this wave of immigrants just as it did to the last one? Have we already seen the first signs of a nativist movement that could actually slam the door on immigrants once again in this new century, just as we did in the last one? In that case, maybe additional features of history will also repeat themselves. Stay tuned to your local Census Bureau statistics and news reports to find out.